Hello, my name is Dr. Ted Allen, and I'm here representing the Ohio State University in my lab, Security and Efficiency Analytics Laboratory. I'd especially like to thank Professors Chattopadhyay and Roy Chowdhury for inviting me and the overall committee for the ICMIAM2021 conference. I'm here to present my presentation with Dr. Enhao, my former PhD student. The presentation is called Cybersecurity, Supercritical Vulnerabilities, and Control Policies, which I think relates directly to the goals of the conference to support efficient asset management. Our work is supported by 2 NSF grants, and the overall outline focuses first on a motivating example, the Equifax hack that affected a large fraction of the US population and some of the international population as well. The vulnerability prioritization and scoring system that we're proposing that will help to address such situations in the future, which will hopefully convince you. The maintenance control policy based on partially observable Markov decision processes, which many of you who know about asset management are familiar with. The optimal classification with leaf branch interaction constraints, which is a modeling formulation which we think is very attractive to a wide variety of classification problems, including predicting whether vulnerabilities have exploits. And I'll finally finish with a brief discussion of the contributions and possibilities for future research. So were you affected by the Equifax breach? Well, when we give this presentation in the United States, the answer is very likely yes. 143 million people were affected. It's just one of the 3 major consumer credit reporting agencies. I don't know if it reaches into Australia, Southern Hemisphere, probably does. And it allowed hackers to gain access to social security numbers, driver's license numbers, and other descriptors for 143 million Americans. So why did this motivate us? Well, the Equifax hack is attributed to the Apache Stretch vulnerability, which has a common vulnerability number 200175638, which was published in March 2017, 6 months, I think, roughly before the actual hack. The CV stands for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. In research, we're focusing on the CV ID number. A patch of the vulnerability was published in March, but the Equifax breach still happened 6 months later. And now, why did that happen? Well, Equifax was aware of its vulnerability that came up in their scans, but they didn't know how important it is. There were several thousand of these vulnerabilities to consider it at the time. Vulnerabilities generally are bugs that, or weak passwords, or other ways that hackers can exploit and gain access to a system, to an asset. This motivates the need to prioritize the right vulnerabilities, thereby saving millions of dollars. So let's talk briefly about the general goal of our vulnerability system. Well, we need to express a classification for vulnerabilities, and we're going to try to see which ones are going to be exploited and have exploits. So actually, we're going to predict probably that a new vulnerability has an exploit available. And there's an ocean of published vulnerabilities, and then there's some that are reserved. Reserve vulnerabilities are created and the vendors reserve them. They're still called 0-day, even though they're sort of semi-published because they're not completely published. Published CVEs are in the National Vulnerability Database, and then some of them have exploits that are known. Now, the CVSS system was proposed, and it gives a level 0 to 10 for each vulnerability. However, most of the vulnerabilities are high or critical. And so with that, if you just cry wolf every time, then a lot of times people don't listen. Not every time, but a lot of times. It's also a static measure. There's small shifts in vulnerabilities. They usually go up, but slowly. And they take a long time to get posted. And that delay can be a big deal. So data coverage, so when we're trying to predict, will this vulnerability be exploited? Is there an exploit? We create a feature, we do data, we find data, and we'll talk more about all that. Then we do feature engineering, then we do classifier selection, and we'll talk more about our innovative ways to do that, but standard ways are pretty good. And then we do some hyperparameter tuning. So the framework, there's first a bunch of data collection. That's where we scrape all this data from the internet. It could be viewed as a source of a type of open source intelligence. Then we create all the features from this. We scrape from Twitter and National Vulnerability Database and Zero Database, the Exploit Database, the Semantic Attack Report. Take all that data, create features. Then we do an ML model to predict, is there a exploit for this? And then we have all the old ones for which we know whether they're exploits. That allows us to get the accurate model. And based on the information that was available at different times. So if we were to monitor this, and just by reading the tweets, which you can, there was actually pretty much, it's official, the Equifax data breach was caused by such and such. And there's other stuff that you could have known from Twitter at the time that would have been pretty helpful. Sometimes you even find hackers who are doing the hacking and writing tweets. And so you can evaluate the likelihood of exploits in the future using machine learning models. So we did that, and this is the result. And in fact, surprise, the vulnerability, this is what the as was would have looked like with our system 6 months before the Equifax hack. We would have picked out the exact vulnerability as the most relevant one. And it was also an outward-facing vulnerability. And so, it was super critical, outward-facing, very high priority, unlike these thousands down below. And so that shows how this approach can be very helpful. So recall it happened in September. We would have given this picture in March. Plenty of time to patch the vulnerability. So maintenance control. Now, another issue has to do with partial observability. So in cybersecurity, you try to suspect everything, but you can't, and because most of the hosts are turned off often, at least at OSU, and turned off during our scanning. And so if you were to track the hosts over time, you'll see a lot of zeros there. Bold zeros mean it's what we call a dark host in the sense that it was turned off. And then it sort of appears and gives a different number, and then it's turned back on. And so, this is a common problem. A lot of the hosts are like this. And this shows how you can use modeling and Bayes' theorem to update your probability that a given dark host has a supercritical vulnerability or critical vulnerability on it. And so you can basically do a pretty good job of predicting, but with some uncertainty. And so basically we studied 21 months of data, and we labeled the actions into 4 different types of actions, and we talked about one action is auto patching, another is to sort of research and accept a vulnerability if you can't find a patch, then research and compensate if you want to remediate the vulnerability, essentially remove some type of access, and then total remediation where you just suspend access to the internet. And so these are different actions that you can do, and different states and different probability states, because you don't know for a lot of the hosts exactly what state they're in. And so, because they were turned off. And so this shows the optimal policies in PLMDP. If you know about that, it relates to the things called alpha vectors, and each alpha vector has an action. And if the cost is essentially lowest for that alpha vector, then you do that action. And so that parameterizes the policy. And we compared this to the out of sight, out of mind policy, which is still a dominating practice, I would guess, where if a host was turned off and we don't know whether it has vulnerabilities, then we just don't hold anyone accountable. Of course, I strongly suspect that in highly classified environments, they tolerate this. But in some universities and other places, they do. And comparing, depending on the different type of hosts, whether or not it has critical data on it, whether or not it has, whether they have root access to the host operator or not, we call it administrator privilege. some of the combinations, the optimal policy is 10 times reduced in cost by reducing incidents, and then also reducing waste of patching vulnerabilities that probably aren't worth patching. And so this is our simulation. I'll show some references later if you want to get into the details. But basically, we can dwarf the costs. And so in terms of asset management, and particularly as billions of devices go on the internet, I think this method is going to be more and more important, and there will be bigger and bigger savings. Let me temper that by saying that in the time since this happened, the organization we work with did actually tighten their ship, restricts a lot of administrative access. So the outside out of some mine policy has generally become a lot less costly, but there's still a potential large cost. And so basically we're saying that if you listen to the policy, patch when the alpha vectors say, do different things that the alpha vectors say, you can really reduce the cost. So just to conclude, this is the conclusion of this part. Compared to the out-of-sight, out-of-mind policy, you can really save a lot of money. That's the basic bottom line. And now one thing that we're working on right now is optimal classification trees with leaf branch constraints. And this could be important to you even if you don't care about cyber vulnerabilities. If you just want machine learning, I mean, we also, for our initial model, the ones I showed you, we used extreme gradient boost trees, but they're not interpretable. And in some of our recent applications, we found that the optimal trees are a lot better at predicting unseen data, test data, and than any of the other methods. And so if you go back in time, just a simple decision tree, if you're over 51.2 years, you have blood pressure above this and that, then you're 99% likely to have this problem. That's the old greedy trees from the 1960s are not considered particularly accurate. But then the optimal decision trees have gotten rebooted. Talk about the paper that did that. Here it is. Well, first this talks about how the tree is defined in optimal formulations and the constraints. And what we found when we saw the great paper by Bertimus and Dutch has been very influential to us, and they proposed some very good heuristics to get near optimal solutions. But we noted recently that they were missing two constraints, so that without those constraints, they can get spurious valuations, and if they solve their formulation optimality, you get junk trees. But with these two constraints, you actually get optimal trees. We've found that it predicts very well in a lot of cases. So the current stage, we have some R code. We're going to make it available as soon as we get the publication. And a lot of people are going to want to use this, I think, for classification. And we are going to use this for our vulnerability prioritization system. So just to kind of discuss what we talked about, the Equifax hack, there's a small number of vulnerabilities that matter. There's thousands of vulnerabilities, but these ones are the ones that matter. In fact, the common vulnerability scoring system has a lot of essentially false positives. And we can predict the exploit existence, and that's really what matters, seemingly, at least in the data sets that we studied. And the maintenance control policy with PLMDP, again, on the maintenance policies on the data set that we studied was hugely successful in terms of reducing the total cost of system operation. And the optimal classification trees are also very successful and may be of interest to a large variety of people. This is my discussion. Just if you want to see the publications that we did, here are some of the journal articles that we published and some manuscripts that are in progress that we're doing. And so feel free to contact me at alan.515@osu.edu, alan.515@osu.edu if you want to obtain any of these manuscripts or make any comments. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. So thank you very much.